everyone knows we've got this rental crisis, right? So Labor can try and paper over the cracks and say, oh, so, supply, but this rental crisis in Australia is very bad. It was all those charts I showed before, very
Yeah.
bad. And Canada was experiencing exactly the same problem, right? A couple of years ago, they way overcooked migration. They did a ginormous migration surge. In 1 year, I think at the peak in 2023, 24, they brought in 1.2 million net overseas migrants. So their entire population growth, which was 1.2 million that year, was net overseas migration. It was just insane. But their government, at least, first they pushed back, and then as people got more and more angry, they then realised, oh, hang on, we've got to basically stop this. And they've effectively implemented almost a 3-year population freeze, whereby they want to basically still have 400,000 or a bit less than that. I think it's 350,000 permanent migrants every year, but they want to manage down the temporary migrant intake from, I think it's 7% or is it 8% of the population? Might even be 9%, but they want to get down to about 5% of the population. So as a result, they're going to have an outflow of temporary migrants. So they're not going to replace the ones whose visas expire and they go home with new ones. And because they're going to have an outflow of temporaries, they can actually, even though they got nearly 400,000 permanent migrants every year, they can basically get population growth down to, close to zero for a couple of years. And then after that, they want to then stabilize at a much lower level. Now, so they brought in this, Canadian rents absolutely soared. I've got a chart on the left there, which was up until it's about 18 months old, 2 years old, from the National Bank of Canada, one of the big banks over there. So it's old data. You can see, at the peak, rents absolutely exploded with population growth. So rents are in red, population growth in blue. Massive rental crisis as a result of the largest immigration influx in history. But last year, the government, implemented these drastic immigration cuts. And as a result, the population growth absolutely tanked in Canada. So they've had like the two of the smallest quarters of population growth. I think one of them was zero. The other one was barely positive in years. And as a result, rents are now falling. So on the right-hand side, the right-hand chart, top right, shows that average asking rents in Canada this is according to rentals.ca, have fallen for 14 consecutive months. And the average asking rent, that's the bottom right hand, has actually come down $100 a month from its peak. Now, they're probably too expensive, but at least their rents are coming down, and they've followed migration down. And Canada's largest bank, BMO, stated that about a month or so ago that, quote, stricter immigration targets continue to slow population growth and limit new household formations. And they forecast that rents would continue to fall because of stricter immigration targets and slower population growth. So, there's a direct lesson here for Australia, right? We've got this worsening rental crisis that just keeps getting worse and worse. We can't build enough homes. We keep bringing in too many people. Just copy Canada, right? So Australia's temporary migrants, if you don't count travellers, tourists, is about 9% of our population. Now, that's a little bit inflated. So that's higher than what Canada's was at the peak, but it's a little bit inflated because it includes New Zealanders who've got open access. So if you strip them out, it's probably about 7%, similar to what Canada's was. We should be managing that down because we've got about 2.6 million temporary migrants in Australia. It was about 1 million about 15 years ago. And that number just keeps getting bigger and bigger. We should be trying to manage that down to, say, 1.5 million. Do what Canada's doing. If we did that and we had 1 million temporary migrants leave over a period of several years, do it over a 5-year period or something, we would actually have a massive drain on net overseas migration. And we should also cut some permanent, categories as well. We should cut that back as well. But there is nothing stopping Australia from emulating Canada. Like every single opinion poll, really in the last decade, but all the recent ones show that Australians want lower immigration. They don't support this. And the reasons for it are all the same stuff that I always go on about: housing, infrastructure, quality of life, blah, blah, blah. Australians want lower immigration. Canadians wanted lower immigration. Canadians got lower immigration. Australia's governments keep gaslighting us. The coalition's completely useless on this as well. and they just keep force feeding us with high immigration. And Canada is a classic example of what you should do. New Zealand as well. So New Zealand's also had a massive reduction in net overseas migration. It's tracking at levels that are a fraction of what the norm has been in the last 20 years or so. And as a result, New Zealand's rents have tanked as well. They're actually falling. So, I got chart in the center there of up to the September quarter of changing asking rents based on rental bonds, negative. The top right is from Justin Farber and Cody Macro. He posted this today. It's the CPI rents inflation. As you can see, that's crashed as well. And the bottom right-hand corner, also from Justin Farber, shows that because population growth's crashed, because immigration's crashed, now housing supply is running way ahead of demand. Who would have thought? And as a result, New Zealand now has a rental market that is getting more and more affordable every single month. Not rocket science. Low immigration equals lower rents, or lower rental, much lower rental growth. Canada proves it. New Zealand proves it. This is not rocket science. This is basic supply-demand economics, right? And when it comes to rents are a lot more pure supply and demand than prices, because prices are impacted by mortgage rates and borrowing and all this other stuff, whereas rents are pretty much tied to incomes and the number of people who are demanding stuff. So it's really more of a pure supply-demand market. So obviously, if you're going to lower, you're going to reduce the number of people coming in every year who need housing, and most migrants rent when they come to Australia. They don't come and buy, they rent. Well, then you're going to obviously improve the rental market. And Canada shows that. New Zealand shows that. What is our government doing? Instead, the Albanese government has lifted the intake for international students. They've lifted the planning level by 25,000 for 2026. That is a soft target. They actually allow universities to go 15% beyond that before any action's taken. So it's really not 25,000. It's more like, I don't know, whatever, like 30 odd thousand, 35, 40,000. They've also watered down a whole bunch of, they've watered down some English language tests. They've also rated about a dozen universities lower risk, which means that they can bring in students without having to prove as much in terms of, providing much documentation and proof that they're genuine students, etc. They've also removed like South Asian students, etc. They've lowered their risk rating, which means they don't have to show as much proof on English language proficiency and financial capacity and stuff like that to come to Australia. So Labor's done a whole bunch of stuff under its Ministerial Direction 115 to basically boost student numbers and boost temporary migration into the country. Their policies are to increase immigration. And if you increase immigration, you make the rental crisis worse. Labor is explicitly doing this. At the same time as I said before, they're not building nearly enough homes. They're building 13% less homes, I think it was, about 13% less than what the coalition built under its term. So they're delivering about 13% less new additions of housing stock than what the coalition did, at the same time as they're pumping migration like there's no tomorrow. They are driving this rental crisis. And why? When they could literally just look at Canada, who's also got a left-leaning government, and copy them, or they can look across the pond and go, oh, gee, it's worked out pretty well for New Zealand to have lower immigration. That's solving the rental crisis. Why don't we do that? Like New Zealand's hasn't been explicit policy like Canada's was. Canada's was an explicit policy to cut immigration, and it's followed through with that policy, and it's bearing the results in the rental market. But, so why isn't a left-leaning government in Australia that is supposed to care about workers and supposed to care about equity and all this stuff? Like, I know they don't, but that's what they're, historically supposed to care about. Not emulating a left-leaning government from Canada who had all the same problems and has taken a set of policy actions that has worked and is actually solving its infrastructure problems and housing problems, etc., by running a lower immigration program. And according to the BMO, their biggest bank, and also the National Bank of Canada, they actually think that Canada's lower immigration has also kept the unemployment rate from rising as much because of Trump's tariffs, etc., because they're not adding as much to the labour supply. So as a result, they also think that this lower immigration is actually benefiting the economy in a per capita sense and also benefiting the labour market by keeping the unemployment rate lower than it otherwise would be. So why isn't our Labor government copying Canada? Like it's a fundamental question here.